The letter arrived after the funeral. She wasn't ready to open it, but what it said left her in tears. The first snowfall of the year descended gently over the city, transforming it into a pristine white canvas. Each flake drifted in a slow, deliberate spiral, as if it had all the time in the world. The cobblestone streets, lined with dimly glowing street lamps, shimmered under the soft glow of snow. Everything felt muted, cloaked in a rare, wintry silence that seemed to hush the bustle of city life. She walked through it all, her boots crunching against the freshly fallen snow, leaving behind a trail of footprints that the persistent flakes would soon erase. Winter had always been her least favorite season. The biting cold, the long nights, it all seemed to emphasize the emptiness she carried inside. This year, though, the chill felt sharper, its sting deeper. As she moved through the streets, wrapped tightly in her coat, her mind wandered to a time when the cold hadn't felt quite so harsh, when her world had been suffused with warmth. It was a warmth born of laughter, of soft touches, of a love that had once made her feel invincible. The first stirrings of that love had begun in the spring, beneath the fluttering blossoms of cherry trees that lined the park paths. Back then, the world had seemed alive with promise, and she, caught in the rhythm of her busy life, had barely noticed the man who would soon become the center of her universe. Their first meeting was unremarkable, a forgotten book left on a library table. He had returned it to her with a quiet smile, the kind of smile that lingered in the mind long after it faded. From that moment on, fate seemed intent on bringing them together. Rain-soaked afternoons, chance encounters at the cafe, the way his gaze would find hers in a crowd, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. He was reckless in his affection, a whirlwind of passion and certainty that contrasted starkly with her guarded heart. She had spent years building walls around herself, cautious and measured in all things, especially love. But he had a way of disarming her, his persistence wearing down her defenses one by one. Before she knew it, she had let him in, her heart tumbling into his hands as easily as the petals that fell from the cherry trees. Summer came, and with it, a season of unbridled joy. Their days were filled with sunlit afternoons and spontaneous adventures. They spent hours wandering through city streets, discovering hidden gems, and creating memories at every turn. Evenings were reserved for stolen moments, whispered secrets, and shared dreams under starlit skies. It was a love that felt effortless, as if the universe had aligned to bring them together. They danced in the rain, their laughter ringing out like music, and held on to each other as if the world might crumble if they let go. In those moments, they were infinite. But the seasons turned, as they always did, and with autumn came a slow and inevitable change. The carefree ease that had defined their summer began to fade, replaced by an undercurrent of tension. He became distant, his once open heart guarded by a wall of his own. Shadows lingered in his gaze, and the warmth she had grown to cherish seemed to slip through her fingers like grains of sand. She told herself it was temporary, that love would be enough to bridge the growing chasm between them. But deep down, she knew better. His life, she realized, was one she could never fully belong to. He carried responsibilities that weighed on him heavily, a future already laid out long before she had entered his life. She saw the conflict in him, the pull of his obligations clashing with his desire to stay. And in the end, duty won. It always did. The night he left, the air was crisp and clear, the first signs of winter creeping into the autumn chill. He held her close, as if trying to memorize every detail, as if he could etch her presence into his very soul. And then he was gone. In the days and weeks that followed, she tried to move forward. She buried herself in work, in hobbies, in anything that might distract her from the void he had left behind. But no matter how hard she tried, he lingered. She saw him in everything, in the reflection of raindrops on her window, in the scent of coffee on quiet mornings, in the melodies of songs they had once sung together. It was as if he had become a ghost haunting her every moment, a part of her she could not escape. Time marched on. The cherry blossoms bloomed and fell, the leaves turned golden and then bare, and the first snow arrived once more. But her heart remained frozen in a perpetual autumn, stuck in the moment he had walked away. Life continued around her. People entered her world, some offering fleeting companionship, others trying to reach the parts of her that still longed for him. None succeeded. Hers was a love that could not be replaced, a love that had etched itself into her very being. On one of her solitary walks through the city, she stumbled upon a small, unassuming shop nestled between two towering buildings. The warm glow of its lights spilled onto the snowy street, drawing her in. Inside, shelves were lined with trinkets and keepsakes, each one seemingly imbued with its own story. It was there that she found the music box. Small and unadorned, it caught her attention nonetheless. She lifted the lid, and as the delicate tune began to play, her breath caught. It was his song, the one he used to hum absent-mindedly, the one that had filled their quiet moments with a sense of peace. The melody awakened a flood of memories. She saw him again, as vividly as if he were standing before her. The way his arms had wrapped around her as they swayed to the music in their tiny apartment, the warmth of his breath against her temple as he whispered promises of forever. Her fingers trembled as she closed the lid, silencing the song but not the ache it had stirred within her. The music had faded, but the memories clung to her, a bittersweet reminder of all she had lost. Stepping back into the cold, she pulled her coat tighter, her breath visible in the frosty air. Snowflakes continued their gentle descent, settling on her hair and coat, tiny reminders of winter's quiet persistence. The city around her buzzed with life, laughter and chatter spilling from cafes, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional bark of a dog. It was a world that had moved on, even as she remained tethered to the past. She wandered through streets that held fragments of their history. The cafe where they had spent lazy afternoons, debating everything from philosophy to their favorite books. The bookstore where they had argued over which novel to buy, only to leave with both. The riverside where they had stood together, hands intertwined, promising forever beneath a canopy of stars. Each place was a chapter in their story, a reminder of a love that had burned brightly but briefly. By the time she reached her apartment, the snow had blanketed the city, softening every edge and muffling every sound. She paused at the door, her gaze lingering on the empty street behind her, half expecting to see him standing there waiting for her with that familiar smile. But of course, he wasn't. He never would be. The past was gone, as unreachable as the stars. The days stretched into weeks, and winter tightened its grip on the city. Snow continued to fall intermittently, sometimes swirling furiously in the wind, other times descending gently, like whispers from the sky. She kept moving through the motions of life, each day blending into the next in a quiet monotony. But no matter how hard she tried to forget, the memories clung to her like the frost on the windows of her apartment. Cold, persistent, and impossible to wipe away entirely. Her apartment remained a silent witness to the love that had once filled it. The books he had read still sat on the shelves, their spines worn from his hands. The photographs she had yet to take down continued to capture fleeting moments of joy. His lopsided grin as he held a melting ice cream cone, the two of them laughing in the rain, their hands intertwined as they gazed at the camera. She couldn't bring herself to remove them, as though doing so would erase the evidence that he had once been part of her world. The sweater he had left behind hung in the corner of her closet. She had tried more than once to pack it away or donate it, but each time she hesitated. There was something about its presence, about the lingering scent of him that clung faintly to the fabric, that kept her tethered to the past. She would catch glimpses of it when she opened her closet, and each time, her chest would tighten with a pang of longing. Winter had a way of amplifying loneliness. The long nights seemed endless, and the cold crept into her bones no matter how many blankets she wrapped around herself. She would often sit by the window, staring out at the snow-covered streets, her mind drifting to the past. She remembered how they used to curl up together on that very couch, a cup of hot cocoa between them, his arm draped around her shoulders as they watched the snow fall. It had been one of their favorite things to do, simply be together, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence. But those days were gone, and no amount of wishing could bring them back. One particularly cold evening, she decided to venture out into the city. She had spent too many nights cooped up in her apartment, and the silence had grown suffocating. She pulled on her coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and stepped out into the brisk night air. The city was quieter than usual, the streets dusted with a fresh layer of snow. The familiar crunch of her boots against the pavement was oddly comforting, a reminder that she was still here, still moving forward, even if it didn't always feel that way. As she wandered aimlessly, she found herself drawn back to the places they had once frequented together. She passed the small bakery where they used to stop for croissants on lazy Sunday mornings. The smell of freshly baked bread wafted out into the street, and for a moment she could almost hear his voice teasing her about always ordering the same thing. She smiled faintly at the memory before moving on. Next, she found herself outside the little art gallery they had discovered by accident one rainy afternoon. It had been nearly empty that day, save for an elderly curator who had eagerly given them a private tour. They had wandered through the exhibits, marveling at the paintings and sculptures, and he had joked about buying one of the abstract pieces that looked like splattered paint. She had laughed, and he had grinned, his eyes crinkling at the corners in that way that always made her heart skip a beat. She stood outside the gallery for a long moment, her breath fogging up the glass as she peered inside. The lights were dim, and the place was closed for the night, but she could still see the faint outlines of the artwork on the walls. It felt like looking through a window into another life, a life where they were still together, still happy. With a sigh, she turned away and continued walking. The streets were nearly deserted, and the only sounds were the soft whisper of the wind and the distant hum of traffic. She wandered without a destination in mind, letting her feet carry her wherever they wanted to go. Eventually, she found herself by the riverside, the place where they had once promised each other forever. The river was frozen now, its surface shimmering under the pale light of the street lamps. She stood at the edge, her hands shoved deep into her coat pockets, and stared out at the icy expanse. This had been their spot, a place where they had shared so many quiet moments, their hearts speaking to each other in ways that words never could. She remembered the night he had told her he loved her for the first time. They had been standing right here, the stars reflected in the dark water below, and he had taken her hand, his voice trembling slightly, as he spoke the words that changed everything. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. She had cried enough tears over him. It was time to let go, to move on. But how did one move on from a love that had felt so all-encompassing, so destined? How did one let go of someone who had become a part of their very soul? As she stood there, lost in thought, she heard a soft sound behind her, the crunch of footsteps on snow. She turned, expecting to see a stranger passing by, but there was no one there. The street was empty, the night as still and silent as ever. She frowned, her heart racing slightly, and shook her head. It was just her imagination, playing tricks on her as it so often did these days. With one last lingering look at the frozen river, she turned and began walking back toward her apartment. The wind had picked up, and the cold stung her cheeks, but she welcomed the sharpness of it. It reminded her that she was still alive, still here, even if part of her felt frozen in time. When she reached her apartment, she kicked off her boots and shrugged off her coat, letting it fall to the floor in a heap. The warmth of the space enveloped her, but it did little to thaw the chill that had settled deep within her. She wandered over to the bookshelf and picked up one of the books he had once read, flipping through the pages absently. His notes were still scrawled in the margins. Little observations, underlined passages, thoughts he had wanted to share with her. She traced the ink with her fingertips, her heart aching at the sight of his familiar handwriting. She set the book down and walked over to the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she stared out at the snow-covered street below. The city was quiet, its lights twinkling like distant stars. Somewhere out there, he was living his life, moving forward, perhaps even happy. She hoped he was. Despite everything, she wanted that for him. She wanted him to find the happiness that had slipped through their fingers. But what about her own happiness? Was it still out there, waiting for her to find it? Or had she given too much of herself to a love that had been doomed from the start? She didn't have the answers, and maybe she never would. But as she stood there watching the snow fall, she realized something. She had survived, even after everything. After the heartbreak, the loneliness, the endless nights of wondering what could have been, she was still here. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. For now. Time had a peculiar way of stretching and folding in on itself, especially when one carried the weight of memories as she did. Winter lingered like a persistent guest, its icy breath threading through the streets, creeping into every corner of the city, and wrapping itself around her life. The snow continued to fall intermittently, dusting the rooftops and sidewalks in white, and though the city carried on, bustling beneath the gray skies, she felt as though she moved through it unseen, like a shadow slipping between moments. Her days were predictable, built from small, repetitive actions that kept her tethered to reality. Each morning she would rise slowly, the early light filtering through her window casting a pale bluish hue over the walls. She would sit at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of steaming coffee, her fingers cradling the warmth of the mug as though it were the only solid thing in her life. The aroma filled the room, familiar and comforting. But even that had its ghosts. Coffee had always been their ritual. She could almost see him there, leaning against the counter, his eyes still sleepy, a soft smile tugging at his lips as he teased her about adding too much sugar. That had been their rhythm once, a quiet kind of intimacy woven through the fabric of their days. Now she was left with the echoes of what had been. She carried on as people do, pulling herself through the hours like someone walking through deep snow, slowly, deliberately, feeling every step as an effort. Her job had become her anchor, a way to lose herself in something outside of her own mind. The office bustled with the chatter of colleagues, the hum of computers, and the shuffle of papers. It wasn't a job she loved, but it wasn't a job she hated either. It simply was. A placeholder, much like the rest of her life. She drifted through meetings and tasks, offering polite smiles, nodding at the right moments, and contributing just enough to be noticed, but never enough to be remembered. And then, at the end of each day, she would leave the office, pull her scarf tightly around her neck, and step out into the cold evening air. It was always the evenings that were the hardest. The world seemed softer then, wrapped in shadows and quiet, and her thoughts would wander more freely, slipping back to the past when she wasn't careful. One such evening, with the sky darkening to a deep, velvety blue, and the streetlights casting pools of golden light on the snowy pavement, she found herself taking a different route home. It wasn't a conscious decision, but rather the kind of instinctive turn that happens when the mind drifts elsewhere. Her feet carried her through streets she hadn't walked in months, past familiar buildings that stirred memories she had tried to bury. The air was sharp and crisp, each breath a reminder of the season's relentless chill. As she walked, she became acutely aware of the silence around her. The city was quieter in winter, as though muffled by the snow, and the only sounds were the soft crunch of her boots on the frozen ground and the distant hum of traffic. There was something peaceful about it, but also something profoundly lonely. She felt like the only person in the world, wandering through a landscape that had once been vibrant and full of life, but was now hushed and still. Without realizing it, she had wandered back to one of the places that held the strongest memories of him. The little cafe stood on the corner, its windows fogged up from the warmth inside, the soft glow of the lights spilling out onto the street. She stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at it. How many afternoons had they spent in there, tucked away at a corner table, sharing quiet conversations and stolen glances? She could almost see them now, seated by the window, their heads close together, his hand resting lightly on hers as they laughed about something only they understood. The ache in her chest deepened, sharp and familiar. She stood there for a long moment, torn between the urge to walk inside and the fear of what she might feel if she did. It wasn't the cafe itself that held the power. It was the memories that clung to it, like ghosts lingering in the air. Eventually, she turned away, her heart heavy, and continued walking. The streets were nearly empty as she wandered on, her thoughts swirling like the snowflakes drifting down around her. She thought about how much had changed, and how much had stayed the same. The city had moved forward, as cities do, but she still felt stuck, trapped in a loop of longing and loss. Every corner seemed to hold a memory, every street a reminder of what had once been. Her feet led her, almost unconsciously, to the riverside. The river was frozen now, its surface smooth and glassy, reflecting the lights of the city in shimmering patterns. She leaned against the railing, her gloved hands gripping the cold metal, and stared out at the ice. This had always been her favorite spot, even before it had become their spot. There was something timeless about the river, something that made her feel both insignificant and infinite at the same time. She closed her eyes, letting the cold air sting her cheeks, and tried to quiet her mind. But the memories came anyway, unbidden and relentless. She could almost hear his voice, low and soft, as they stood there together on a night much like this one. She could feel the warmth of his hand in hers, the steady rhythm of his breathing as they leaned against each other, lost in the beauty of the moment. They had promised each other forever here, beneath the stars, with the river flowing quietly beneath their feet. But forever had slipped through their fingers, as fragile and fleeting as snowflakes melting on warm skin. She opened her eyes, blinking away the tears that threatened to fall, and took a deep breath. The past was a weight she carried with her, but it didn't have to define her. She had survived the heartbreak, the endless nights of wondering what could have been. She was still here, and maybe that was enough. As she stood there, lost in thought, she heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the snow behind her. At first, she didn't think anything of it. People often passed by, taking in the view or hurrying to their next destination. But these footsteps slowed as they neared her, and a strange sensation washed over her. A flutter of recognition, a spark of something she couldn't quite name. She turned, her heart pounding in her chest, and froze. He was standing there just a few feet away, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, his hair dusted with snowflakes. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Time folded in on itself, and it was as though no time had passed at all. He looked the same, and yet different. Older, perhaps, or maybe just warier. There was something in his gaze, something that spoke of regret and longing, and it made her chest ache. They stared at each other in silence, the weight of everything that had been left unsaid hanging between them. She felt a rush of emotions, shock, anger, longing, all colliding within her, leaving her breathless. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the moment, trying to understand how he could be standing here, after all this time, as though he had stepped out of her memories and into her reality. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if this was fate's way of giving them a second chance, or just a cruel trick designed to remind her of what she had lost. She didn't know the answer, and maybe she never would. But as they stood there, with the snow falling softly around them and the river shimmering in the distance, she felt something stir within her, a tiny spark, a flicker of hope in the cold, dark winter. The air hung heavy with silence, the soft fall of snow absorbing the city's usual noise, muffling the world in a blanket of quiet. It was the kind of silence that could make a person feel both comforted and profoundly alone. She had grown used to it over the months, had learned to live with it, even to find solace in it. But tonight, as she stood by the riverside, her breath visible in the icy air, that silence felt different. It felt charged, like something was waiting just beyond the edge of understanding, something she could sense but not yet see. The river stretched out before her, frozen and shimmering under the soft glow of the streetlights. She had always loved this place, always found peace in the way the water moved endlessly, carrying time and memories away with its steady current. But tonight, the river was still, trapped beneath a layer of ice, as though even it had paused, holding its breath in anticipation. She wasn't sure what had led her here. Her feet had carried her, unthinking, through the snow-covered streets, past familiar buildings and forgotten landmarks, until she had found herself standing here, in the place where everything had once felt possible. It had been their place once, a sanctuary away from the chaos of the city, a place where they had whispered dreams and promises beneath the starlit sky. She hadn't been here since he left. The memories had been too raw, too painful. But tonight something had drawn her back, as though the past had reached out, pulling her gently but insistently toward this place. As she stood there, lost in thought, she became aware of the sound of footsteps behind her. Soft, hesitant, as though the person wasn't sure they wanted to be heard. She didn't turn around at first. She was used to the comings and goings of strangers, to the quiet passing of lives that touched briefly before continuing on their separate paths. But something about these footsteps felt different. There was a familiarity in the rhythm, in the way they slowed as they neared her, and before she even turned, her heart began to race. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat, and there he was. He stood just a few feet away, his coat dusted with snow, his eyes dark and searching as they locked onto hers. For a moment, she thought she might be dreaming. It wouldn't have been the first time. She had seen him in her dreams so many times, had imagined him standing before her with that same look in his eyes, the look that had once made her believe that love could conquer anything. But this wasn't a dream. He was real. He was here. A wave of emotions crashed over her, so intense that she had to grip the railing to steady herself. Shock, disbelief, anger, and something else, something softer, something she had tried to bury but which rose to the surface now, overwhelming her with its quiet insistence. Love. It was still there, buried beneath the layers of time and pain, but it hadn't disappeared. It hadn't faded. She stared at him, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. He looked older, somehow. Not in a way that had to do with age, but in the way that people change when life has worn them down, when they've carried burdens too heavy to bear alone. There was a weariness in his eyes, a sadness that hadn't been there before, and it made her chest ache. She had spent so many nights wondering where he was, what he was doing, whether he had moved on. And now, here he was, standing before her, looking at her as though she was the only thing in the world that mattered. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They simply stood there, caught in a moment that felt both endless and fleeting, as though the universe had paused, holding its breath along with them. She could feel the weight of all the unspoken words hanging in the air between them, all the things they hadn't said, all the questions that had been left unanswered. But beneath all of that, there was something else, a connection, a pull. It had been there from the moment they met, and it was still there now, stronger than ever. He took a step toward her, his movements slow and tentative, as though he was afraid she might disappear if he moved too quickly. She felt her heart clench at the sight of him, at the vulnerability in his eyes, and for a moment she thought she might cry. She had spent so long building walls around her heart, convincing herself that she didn't need him, that she was better off without him. But now, with him standing right in front of her, those walls began to crumble. She remembered the way he used to look at her, with that same mix of wonder and tenderness, as though he couldn't quite believe she was real. She remembered the way his touch had made her feel safe, the way his laughter had filled the empty spaces in her heart. She remembered the promises they had made, the dreams they had shared, the love that had once seemed unbreakable. And she remembered the pain of losing him, the ache that had settled deep in her chest and refused to let go. But even after all of that, even after everything they had been through, she still loved him. She hadn't wanted to admit it, hadn't wanted to face the truth, but it was undeniable now. Love didn't just disappear. It lingered, quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment when it could bloom again. He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them, and for a moment, she hesitated. She wasn't sure if she could survive losing him again. She wasn't sure if she could open herself up to that kind of pain. But then she saw the look in his eyes, the same look that had once made her believe in forever, and she knew that she had to try. She lifted her hand slowly, her fingers brushing against his, and in that moment, something shifted. It was as though the weight of the past began to lift, as though the cracks in her heart began to heal. Their hands fit together perfectly, just as they always had, and she felt a warmth spread through her, chasing away the cold that had settled in her bones. As they stood there, hands entwined, the snow continued to fall around them, covering the world in a blanket of white. The city moved on, oblivious to the two figures standing by the riverside, caught in a moment that felt both timeless and infinite. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if they could rebuild what had been lost, if they could find their way back to each other after everything that had happened. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't ready to let him go. Not again. Because love, real love, was worth fighting for. It was worth the pain, the uncertainty, and the fear. It was worth everything. As they stood there with the river frozen before them and the snow falling softly around them, she felt a flicker of hope. A fragile, beautiful hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. The past was still there, lingering in the shadows, but it no longer felt as heavy. It no longer felt like a weight she had to carry alone. Together they could face whatever came next. Together they could find a way to heal, to grow, to love. And as she looked into his eyes, she knew that they would. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be perfect, but it would be real. And that was enough. The snow fell, the river shimmered, and for the first time in a long, long time, she felt warm again.